Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be doing a simple watercolor tutorial of this beautiful gondola. The reference picture I'm using is of Gulmarg Gondola, which I got from Unsplash. I'll be using the Breeze palette from Toogies. I love this palette because it contains all the colors that we need as a beginner. Let's begin. I'm taking some Payne's Grey to begin with the mountains. Take a diluted mixture and start adding some marks on the mountain shapes. Now remember that you shouldn't add it like a border for the mountains. Here and there, just make small marks as shown. Use a brush with a good tip so that you get very sharp lines. These are the rocky forms we see on the snowy mountains. I will try to keep this video as real time as possible so you can follow along. This region has shadow of the mountain in the front, so this part is slightly darker. I am using a wet brush to remove all the sharp marks in this area to show that it's a shadowy area. Now the rest of the area I'm adding sharp lines so that we have very distinct features of the mountains. Next I'm mixing very small amount of you can use a yellow ochre or any Indian yellow, any orangish color, and mix it with Payne's Grey and add it to this part of the mountains. Take a damp brush and smudge these lines so that you don't have very sharp lines here. Now once again take a diluted mixture of Payne's Grey and more lines and marks here and there. I am marking some more peaks using the Payne's Grey color. If you observe, I have left some of the part of the mountains as is. So I don't want to add all of these as border. Like I said earlier, we only need to mark the shape of these peaks. Increase and decrease the pigment as you see fit to bring in the shape and character of the snowy mountains. I will slightly fast forward at this point since it's a repetitive thing. I'm adding a darker pigment of Payne's Grey at this point to show a shadow region, and then I'm taking a wet brush and then smudging out the lines so as to not have any sharp lines. Dilute this Payne's Grey and orange mixture further and apply to this part. We'll be adding different greens here, so take any other green like sap green or viridian hue and add it to this part of the mountain wet on wet so that we don't have very sharp lines. Next I'm mixing more of this Indian yellow into the Payne's Grey and adding it to this part of the mountain. The foremost part of this mountain has a lot of pine trees, so I'm leaving off that part for now. Continue painting this part of the mountain that is behind the pine trees with the yellowish or orangish and Payne's Grey mixture all throughout. But remember to use a diluted mixture. We don't want a lot of pigment at this point. Now for some more textures on this part, I'm using Payne's Grey once again. Make note of the consistency of the paint at this point. It's not very dark, it's slightly diluted, but not so much that it looks transparent. Slightly increase the pigment of the different shades that we see in the mountain and then add it as you see fit. Remember that watercolor dries lighter, so you need to keep this in mind when you are adding any colors. You do not want to be disappointed after the painting dries, hence keep in mind that you need to add the right amount of pigment and that it will dry lighter than what you see. Hence I am adding more pigment at this point. Also, it is better to work in layers rather than adding a very dark pigment in the beginning itself. If you do this, you will not get the delicacy of the watercolor paintings you see. Use a damp brush to blur any sharp lines. Unless you want them to look sharp, make sure to blur them all the time. This will give a dreamy look to your watercolors. You can ignore this next part as I will be painting over them. I did not like how it looked when I added these lighter trees in the beginning, so I'll be painting over them. Hence feel free to ignore the smaller pine trees at the back. However, do add this one single pine tree in the front. For this I've used a light and dark green mixture here and there. Let's start painting the skies. For this I'm wetting whole of the skies. Be careful when you're wetting the area near the mountains. I suggest you leave a small gap between the wet area and the mountains. So this way when you add the blue color to the sky, you will be using your tip of the brush, and this way it will not spread, the water will not seep into the mountains. Use any blue for the sky you like. Here I'm using a cobalt blue and a peacock blue mixture. I'm also leaving some space for the clouds since the background is wet, so we will have soft fluffy clouds here. You can either skip this step if you're not comfortable, or add clouds as you see fit. Let's start working on the ground here. For this, once again I'm using wet on wet. Wet the whole of the paper when there is this green patch here with water, and then add any light green you have around this tree. Use a slightly darker green to the edges and then use a damp brush to soften the edges. I'm also adding a bit of slope here using the dark green color. Lifting a bit of paint here to show the separation between different ridges. Make sure the background is dry before you start painting the gondola. For this, I've mixed some orange and red as I wanted it to be very bright. To show that the sun is hitting directly on this, we need it to be a very bright orange red. Hence, make sure your red is warm and bright. Take dark Payne's grey and paint the rest of the part of the gondola. Let's wait for the sky part to dry. Until then, I'm painting with the darker green all of the rest of the pine. Now I tried painting around the lighter green pines that I added, but it wasn't looking good enough. Hence, I'll be covering whole of the part later on. Use any dark green you have to paint this area, and make sure you keep the pointy needles on the top. And then use a dark green mixture on the lower part and use a damp brush to soften the edges here. Use dark green as you see fit wherever you want to add more shadows. Make sure the red color you have applied has dried before doing this part. Take a good amount of Payne's grey and paint the inside part of this gondola. This seems to have a slightly darker tint on the mirror or the glass that is there, and there is a darker strip on the lower side. So use more pigment when you paint this part. Make sure this dark color does not enter into the red part of the gondola. Make sure the sky is absolutely dry before you proceed. I think my sky is still wet, so I'm proceeding with the lone pine tree that is there in the front. I'm adding more lighter and darker greens to create in some more texture for this tree. Using a well pigmented Payne's grey to paint the lower part of this gondola and adding some border to this glass. I have made several mistakes when painting this painting. Initially I thought of discarding this video, but then I thought this would help the beginners to know that it's okay to make mistakes and they can be fixed. So if you see there was paint that seeped into the red color, I just used a damp brush and softly erased it off. And I also told in the beginning that my pine trees also weren't perfect in the beginning, and I painted right over it. So it's okay to make mistakes, but what's important is that you keep trying to get better. You see the cables that I'm drawing are also not very perfect, so make sure you're drawing very thin lines for the cables of this gondola. I'm taking a dark green mixture where I've mixed Payne's grey into the darker green that I had to create some pine trees in the foreground. Once again, I'm adding the ground here and taking a damp brush and blending it into the ground that is already there. I've taken a very diluted mixture of Payne's grey and I'm adding more shadows here on these mountains. You can skip this step if you like it how it looks already. Take the dark green mixture and add some sprinkles as shown. You will need to have a lot of paint in your brush to get good amount of sprinkles. I'm also adding some grass texture here on the lower side. Continue adding the sprinkles as much as you want, but make sure you're not adding a lot of it. And we are done with the painting. We are removing the tape and seeing how it looks. I hope you will try the simple painting and tag me on social media. I would love to see your take on it and give you a shout out. See you in the next video. Bye bye.